The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Texas plains, carrying ice and snow that stung exposed skin like angry wasps. Margaret Wilson pressed her face against the frosted window of her small cabin, watching the world disappear into white chaos. It was January 1868, and this blizzard was unlike anything she had seen in her 3 years on the frontier. Her husband Thomas had left 2 days earlier to fetch supplies from the settlement 20 miles east, promising to return before the weather turned. Now she could barely see the barn 30 feet from her door. Margaret pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned back to the fireplace, where precious logs crackled and popped. She had enough wood for maybe 3 more days if she was careful. The cabin felt impossibly small and impossibly large at the same time, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of frozen death. She stirred the pot of beans hanging over the fire, trying not to think about Thomas caught somewhere in that white hell. He was strong and resourceful, she told herself. He would find shelter. He had to. The sound came just after dark, a thin, wavering cry that cut through the wind's roar. At first, Margaret thought she had imagined it, that loneliness and worry were playing tricks on her mind. But there it came again, weak but unmistakable. A baby's cry. She grabbed her heavy coat and lit the oil lantern, her hands shaking as she wrestled with the door against the wind's pressure. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and bringing tears that froze on her cheeks. She held the lantern high, squinting against the horizontal snow. Nothing but white darkness. Then she heard it again, closer now, and her light caught something dark against the snow near the woodpile. Margaret stumbled forward, her boots sinking deep with each step. It was a bundle of furs, and inside, wrapped in deerskin and buffalo hide, was an infant. A Comanche baby, she realized immediately, seeing the cradle board and the intricate beadwork on the wrappings. The child's lips were blue, its cries growing weaker. Margaret didn't hesitate. She scooped up the bundle and fought her way back to the cabin, slamming the door against the wind. Inside, she carefully unwrapped the baby, a little girl, perhaps 6 months old, with dark eyes that looked up at her with fading awareness. The child's skin was cold as marble, and Margaret's nursing training from her years in Philadelphia came rushing back. She stripped away the frozen outer wrappings and pressed the baby against her own warm skin under her clothes, wrapping them both in blankets by the fire. 4 hours, Margaret worked to warm the child, rubbing her tiny limbs gently, breathing warm air on her face, dripping sugar water between her lips. The baby's breathing was shallow and rapid, her little body fighting hypothermia with everything it had. Margaret prayed, not the polite prayers of Sunday church, but desperate bargaining with God himself. She had lost her own baby 2 years ago, stillborn after a difficult labor that nearly killed her. The doctor in Philadelphia had said she would likely never carry another child to term. Now, holding this dying infant, Margaret felt something break open inside her chest. Near midnight, the baby's eyes opened fully and she let out a strong, angry cry, the most beautiful sound Margaret had ever heard. The child was hungry, furiously hungry, and Margaret had no milk to give. She mixed sugar water with a little cornmeal, creating a thin gruel that she fed to the baby drop by drop using a clean cloth. The infant sucked greedily, color returning to her cheeks. Margaret laughed and cried at the same time, rocking the child and singing softly. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, life had defeated death, at least for tonight. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm had blown itself out sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed into strange, sculptured drifts of white. Margaret woke with a start, momentarily confused by the warm weight on her chest. The baby. The Comanche baby was sleeping peacefully, her tiny fist curled against Margaret's collarbone. Reality crashed back, bringing with it a flood of questions and fears that Margaret had been too exhausted to consider during the night's desperate hours. Where were this child's parents? How had she come to be left outside Margaret's cabin? The Comanche were fierce protectors of their children, everyone on the frontier knew that. No mother would willingly abandon her baby in a blizzard. Margaret rose carefully, laying the sleeping infant in a nest of blankets near the fire. She dressed warmly and stepped outside, dreading what she might find. The snow was knee-deep in places, sculpted by wind into sharp ridges and smooth valleys. Margaret began searching in widening circles from where she had found the baby. 20 yards from her cabin, she found the first body. A Comanche woman, young and beautiful even in death, lay face down in the snow. She had crawled, Margaret realized, seeing the trail. Crawled from somewhere, dragging herself forward with her last strength. Margaret turned the woman over gently, noting the arrow wound in her back and the frost that had crystallized on her eyelashes. She had been dead for hours before Margaret found her baby. 30 yards further, Margaret found 2 more bodies, Comanche warriors, both young men who had died fighting. Their weapons were still clutched in frozen hands, and their bodies bore multiple wounds. One had an army saber buried in his chest. Margaret's stomach turned. This had been a skirmish, a small battle between army scouts and a Comanche raiding party, probably caught by the storm just as it began. She had heard about increased tensions between the tribes and the army patrols, but out here, miles from the nearest fort, she had felt removed from such violence. She found 3 more bodies scattered across the white landscape, all warriors, all clearly having died fighting or trying to escape. The woman must have been fleeing with them, perhaps a wife or sister to one of the fighters. When she was wounded, she had known she was dying. Her last act had been to leave her baby where she had seen smoke rising from Margaret's chimney, a desperate gamble that whoever lived in that cabin might have more mercy than the freezing night. Margaret stood in the snow, looking at the bodies of the dead warriors, and felt the weight of what she had done. She had saved a Comanche child. The army would say she should have let nature take its course, that the Comanche were hostile and dangerous. Her neighbors at the distant settlement would call her a fool or worse. But Margaret thought of that little girl sleeping by her fire, of her tiny fist and her strong cry, and knew she would make the same choice 1,000 times over. She spent the morning in grim work, dragging the bodies to a sheltered spot near a grove of cottonwoods. She couldn't dig graves in the frozen ground, but she could at least gather them together and cover them with stones and branches to protect them from scavengers. As she worked, she noticed something: markings on the warriors' shields and clothing, specific designs that she had seen before in a book Thomas kept. These weren't random raiders. They were from a specific band, probably part of a larger group that ranged across this territory. The implications hit her like cold water. The Comanche would come looking for their missing people. They would track them to this spot, find the bodies, and see her cabin nearby. They would know someone had taken the baby. Margaret's hands shook as she placed the last stone. She could leave, she thought wildly. Pack up and head east to the settlement before anyone came. But Thomas would return here looking for her. And the baby was too weak to travel in this cold. Besides, where could she go that the Comanche couldn't follow if they wanted to? Margaret returned to her cabin and bolted the door, suddenly aware of how alone and vulnerable she was. She loaded Thomas's rifle, which she barely knew how to use, and checked that she had powder and shot. Then she picked up the baby, who was awake and watching her with those serious dark eyes, and made a decision that surprised even herself. If the Comanche came, she would not hide what she had done. She would show them their child, alive and well. She would give the baby back and hope for mercy. It was the only honorable path she could see, though it might very well end with her own death. 3 days passed in tense silence. Each morning, Margaret woke expecting to see warriors surrounding her cabin. Each evening, she barred the door and slept fitfully with the rifle within reach. Thomas had not returned, and Margaret tried not to imagine the worst. The baby, whom she had started calling Little Bird in her mind, was growing stronger. She had adapted the feeding routine, mixing cornmeal with sugar water and a bit of bacon fat to give the child more nourishment. Little Bird was eating well now, and her personality was emerging, curious, alert, and surprisingly quick to smile. Margaret found herself talking to the baby constantly, narrating her actions as she worked. "Now we're adding wood to the fire, Little Bird. See how the flames dance? Your people know fire is sacred. I read that once." She sang songs her own mother had taught her, lullabies from Ireland that her grandmother had sung. The baby seemed to respond to the music, waving her tiny fists and making cooing sounds that squeezed Margaret's heart. The cabin, which had felt so lonely before, now felt alive with purpose. Margaret washed the baby's wrappings and examined them closely. The beadwork was exquisite, telling stories in colored patterns that Margaret couldn't fully understand. The cradle board was made from soft wood, carefully shaped and padded with rabbit fur. Someone had loved this child dearly, had crafted these items with great care. The thought of the mother, dying in the snow with her last thoughts on her baby's survival, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. On the 4th day, Margaret saw smoke signals rising from the hills to the west. 3 columns of smoke, rising and disappearing in a pattern. She didn't know what the signals meant, but she knew they meant something. That night, she held Little Bird close and made preparations. She packed a small bundle with the baby's Comanche wrappings and beadwork, wrapped carefully. She wrote a letter to Thomas, telling him what had happened and that she loved him. She cleaned the cabin and made it as presentable as she could, some instinct telling her that first impressions might matter. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret was stirring the fire when she heard it, the sound of many horses. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved to the window. What she saw made her breath catch. Not 10 or 20 warriors, but at least 100 Comanche riders, stretching across the snowy plain in a long line. They wore war paint and carried weapons, their faces stern and impassive. At their center rode a man who could only be a chief, his bearing radiating authority even at a distance. Margaret's first instinct was to hide, to grab Little Bird and barricade herself inside. But she forced herself to stand tall. She wrapped the baby in a clean blanket, making sure the child's face was visible, and stepped outside onto her small porch. The cold air bit at her face, but she stood firm, holding Little Bird in her arms where the warriors could see her. The line of horses stopped 50 yards from the cabin. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind and the occasional snort from a horse. Then the chief dismounted. He was a tall man, perhaps 50 years old, with scars marking his arms and chest despite the cold. His eyes were hard and measuring as they swept over Margaret, the cabin, and finally came to rest on the baby in her arms. 3 other warriors dismounted with him, including a younger man who looked so much like one of the dead warriors that Margaret knew immediately this must be his brother or son. The chief raised his hand, and the warriors behind him relaxed slightly but remained alert. He spoke in Comanche, his voice deep and controlled. Margaret shook her head, her throat tight. "I don't understand. I'm sorry. I don't speak your language." She held the baby out slightly, letting them see that Little Bird was alive, well-fed, and clean. "I found her. In the storm. I brought her inside. I saved her." The chief's eyes narrowed, studying Margaret intensely. Then he spoke again, this time in halting but clear English. "You take our child." It was a statement, not a question, laden with implications Margaret couldn't fully read. She nodded, finding her voice. "Her mother left her at my door. In the blizzard. She was dying. I couldn't let the baby die too." Margaret's voice cracked. "I found her body. All of them. I'm so sorry for your loss." The chief's face remained unreadable as Margaret's words hung in the frozen air. He turned to the younger warrior beside him and spoke rapidly in Comanche. The younger man's face twisted with grief and rage, and he took a step forward, hand moving to his knife. Margaret's grip tightened on Little Bird, but she didn't step back. She had decided she would not show fear, would not dishonor the courage of the mother who had died trying to save this child. The chief barked a sharp command and the young warrior stopped, though his eyes blazed with pain. The chief turned back to Margaret and spoke in English again. "Show me where they are. The bodies." It was not a request. Margaret nodded and, still holding Little Bird, walked slowly toward the cottonwood grove where she had laid the bodies. The chief and several warriors followed, their footsteps crunching in the crusty snow. When they reached the spot, Margaret stepped back as the warriors moved forward to uncover what she had done. The chief knelt beside the woman's body, and for the first time, his face showed emotion, a deep, terrible sadness that aged him before Margaret's eyes. He touched the woman's frozen face with a gentleness that spoke of profound love. His daughter, Margaret realized. This was his daughter. The young warrior who had wanted to attack Margaret knelt beside another body, weeping openly now. The other warriors moved among the dead, identifying each one, touching them in farewell. Margaret stood holding the baby, tears streaming down her own face, feeling like an intruder in this moment of grief. She understood now why 100 warriors had come. These were not just fighters from a raiding party. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. Each one of these bodies represented a hole torn in the fabric of their community. The chief stood slowly and walked back to Margaret. His face was hard again, but his eyes held something complex. Grief, yes, but also something else. He looked at the baby in Margaret's arms, and Little Bird chose that moment to reach out toward him, making a cooing sound. The chief's composure cracked for just a second before he controlled it. He spoke to the warriors behind him, giving orders that sent them moving quickly. Some warriors began preparing the bodies for transport, wrapping them carefully in hides and blankets. Others walked back toward the cabin, and Margaret's stomach clenched with fear. But the chief held up his hand, a gesture that she understood meant she should wait. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes boring into hers as if trying to see into her soul. "You feed her? You keep her warm?" Margaret nodded. "Yes. I fed her. Kept her by the fire. I have a little food she can eat. I made sure she was safe." The chief reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements so as not to startle her, and touched Little Bird's hand. The baby grabbed his finger with surprising strength, and a ghost of a smile flickered across his weathered face. "This child is my granddaughter. The last child of my daughter. My daughter's husband died 3 moons ago, in raid." My daughter was bringing the baby to our winter camp when soldiers attacked. She was not fighter. She was mother, going home. Margaret felt sick. The woman had been trying to return to safety, had been caught in violence that wasn't her fight. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered. She was very brave. With her last strength, she brought the baby to my door. She knew she was dying, and she trusted me to save her child. I would have done anything to save her too, if I could have. The chief nodded slowly. White woman has honor. This is rare thing. He looked back at his warriors, who had returned to the cabin and were now standing in a line, holding items Margaret recognized, her supplies, some of her goods, but also other things. New things. Buffalo hides, beaded items, dried meat, clay pots. The young warrior who had been so angry earlier approached, carrying a beautiful beaded cradle board and a warm buffalo robe. The chief spoke again, his English slow but clear. Comanche law is clear. You save life of our people, we owe you life debt. But this is not simple. You are white. Your soldiers kill our people. Your settlers take our land. Many warriors say we should take child and leave you nothing. Some say worse. Margaret's heart pounded, but she kept her eyes on his face. But, the chief continued, I am chief. I see what is true. You did not have to save my granddaughter. You could let her die and no one would know. But you risk everything to save Comanche child. This is great courage. This is great heart. The chief raised his hand high, and every warrior fell silent. He spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying across the snowy plain, rising and falling in what was clearly a formal speech. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she heard the cadence of ritual, of tradition being invoked. The warriors listened intently, and gradually, their rigid postures began to soften. When the chief finished, several warriors nodded. The young warrior who had been so angry approached and spoke briefly to the chief, then turned to Margaret and gave her a slight bow, his hand over his heart. The chief turned back to Margaret. I tell them the story. How you save child in storm. How you honor our dead. How you stand brave when 100 warriors come. The council decides, you have honored us. We will honor you. He gestured, and the warriors began bringing forward the items they held. These are gifts. We bring buffalo robes to keep you warm. Food for winter. We bring tools and blankets. We bring peace. Margaret's eyes widened as the pile of gifts grew. These weren't simple trade goods, they were valuable items, things that represented significant wealth among the Comanche. The buffalo robes alone were worth more than everything she and Thomas owned. I can't accept all this, she protested. I just did what anyone should do. She's a baby. I couldn't let her die. The chief's expression was stern. You must accept. Is our way. Life debt must be paid. To refuse is insult. He paused, then his face softened slightly. You save more than child. You save future of my family. My daughter's daughter is all I have left of her now. This child will grow, will remember. Will tell her children about white woman who saved her when she could have let her die. He gestured to the warriors. Every man here knows this story now. We will tell our people. There is one white woman who showed honor. One settler who chose life over hate. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. She looked down at little Bird, who was watching everything with those alert dark eyes. What will you name her? The chief smiled for the first time, a real smile that transformed his face. Her mother named her Nadua. It means someone found in our language. But now she has 2 names. We will also call her Saves Life, because she was saved and because her saving brings peace between enemies. He reached out and took the baby gently from Margaret's arms. Little Bird went to him without protest, and Margaret felt her heart break and heal at the same time. The chief held his granddaughter close, breathing in her scent, checking her carefully with experienced hands. When he was satisfied she was truly well, he looked at Margaret with something that might have been respect. You have husband? Margaret nodded, her voice thick. He went for supplies. He should be back soon. The chief nodded thoughtfully. We will send scouts. If he travels, we will find him. We will make sure he comes home safe. This is part of gift. Over the next hour, the warriors carefully loaded the gifts into Margaret's cabin, so many items that the small space was transformed. They brought in enough food to last the rest of the winter and into spring. They brought medicine herbs and showed her how to use them. An older warrior who spoke some English explained the properties of each plant, making Margaret repeat the information until he was satisfied she understood. They repaired her fence, reinforced her barn, and cut enough firewood to last 3 months. Margaret watched it all with a sense of unreality. Just days ago, she had been alone and frightened, preparing for death. Now her cabin was full of life-saving supplies given by the very people her neighbors considered mortal enemies. The young warrior who had been so angry earlier approached her shyly and pressed something into her hand, a small carved bird, perfectly detailed, made from white stone. "For what you did," he said in halting English. "My brother's daughter lives because of you." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the chief called his warriors together. They would make camp a few miles away for the night, he explained to Margaret, to properly prepare their dead for the journey home. Before they left, the chief brought little bird, Nadua, back to Margaret one last time. "Hold her," he said. "Remember." Margaret cradled the baby close, memorizing her weight, her smell, the feeling of her tiny hand grasping Margaret's finger. She kissed the baby's forehead and whispered, "Be strong, little bird. Grow up brave like your mother. Remember there is kindness in the world." The chief took his granddaughter and mounted his horse in one fluid motion, the baby secure in a new cradle board. He looked down at Margaret one last time. "You are under protection of our people now. Any Comanche who sees you will know you are friend. I give you name in our language, Kwasa Tuinpu. It means gray shawl for the covering you wore when you saved my granddaughter. This name will protect you." He raised his hand in farewell, and the line of warriors began to move, riding west into the setting sun. Margaret stood in the snow watching them go until they disappeared into the landscape. She felt emptied out, hollowed by the intensity of the last few days. But she also felt something else, a strange sense of hope. In a land torn by violence and hatred, she had found connection in the most unlikely place. She had saved a life and in doing so had discovered that mercy could bridge even the widest divide. 3 days later, Thomas returned, exhausted and frostbitten but alive. He stared in shock at the transformed cabin, at the wealth of supplies, at his wife's story that seemed impossible yet was undeniably true. Margaret showed him the carved bird, the buffalo robes with their distinctive patterns, the gifts that spoke of honor and debt. She showed him the letter she had written, expecting to die, and then tore it up while he held her close. Years later, Margaret would learn that the story had spread far beyond that one band. The tale of the gray-shawled woman who saved a Comanche baby became legend among the tribes. Throughout the brutal decades of the Indian Wars, Margaret's cabin was never attacked. Comanche riders passing by would leave gifts, a deer carcass, tanned hides, medicine herbs. Soldiers and settlers thought she had made some kind of deal with the savages. But Margaret knew the truth. She had simply chosen compassion in a moment when fear would have been easier. And that choice had created ripples that spread farther than she could have imagined. In her old age, Margaret would sit by her fire and remember those days. She would remember the weight of a baby in her arms, the face of a grieving chief, and the moment when 100 warriors chose honor over vengeance. She would remember that even in the darkest winter, there are still those who choose to save rather than destroy, who see the humanity in a stranger's face and act with courage. And she would remember little bird, Nadua, saves life, and wonder what kind of woman she had grown to be, carrying within her the story of the night a white woman and a Comanche mother made the same choice, separated by death but united in love.